There are a lot of different places that one could begin with this question. I think that it's one of the great questions facing us, and there are a number of facets here. Obviously, when the language begins to decompose to the point that you find break off almost languages with break off jargons, break off dialects almost that emerge from a common source, that can be an indication of a general failure on the part of a culture to hold the center together. And I think that's definitely part of what we're seeing. We've seen this sort of dumbing down of our language to such a point that we've lost our ability to find the proper words to describe the concepts that confront us even on a day-to-day basis. And a natural consequence of this is that we have to go groping for new ones. In consequence, so people find new words, they invent new words in many cases, they find new expressions to talk about these things. Many of these terms are in a way superfluous because one can certainly find alternatives, valid alternatives in our massive English lexicon. But since we've lost that, we need to go somewhere to find it. And that's, of course, is just a consequence of the dumbing down, particularly of America. But this is also a universal phenomenon. It's not limited to our country. It might be particularly acute in our country because if you compare the political discourses or the public discourses of our contemporaries against those of even, say, 100 years ago, not to speak of 200 years ago, the tremendous and horrifying poverty of our language really comes home. So again, this might just be a consequence of us trying to reconstitute what has been deliberately eroded through any number of efforts, I think, really to work through the education in an effort to make people stupider than they really are by eliminating concepts within our language. This is exacerbated by other trends in our contemporary society, many of which are really aimed at substituting old concepts with new concepts in an effort to remake our worldview in a sense that is, more applicable, more uh, it's readier to accept the new world that is coming into existence around us. And Jason, this is where your work comes in. I mean, your work with the vocabulary, working with the vocabulary, which in many cases is simply attempting to, reacquire some of the old meanings of words. In many cases, it's almost a kind of, lexical warfare, as it were, an effort to really protect ourselves from the damage that's being done against us deliberately on the part of people who want to use the language in order to change the way we think. And that's an absolutely honorable endeavor. It's very, very necessary in our time. So that's part of it. We're playing a number of word games, as it were, but these are word games that are of essential and vital interest to us because without the power of language to protect us, to allow us to understand ourselves and the world around us, we are absolutely defenseless when it comes to those individuals who really would like to prey on our inability to even articulate our idea of ourselves and of our societies, of our ethnos, of our race, our societies. All of these things play into it. So that's another element of it. I think at the profoundest level, I mean, there's more that could be said. There are other changes yet that have come upon us, but I think that at the profoundest level, what we're seeing here is part and parcel of the absence of a unified culture underneath us, something that is capable of sustaining us, a bedrock to which we can all turn. If we had a healthy underpinning, many of these changes would not have been possible, and consequently, many of the response to these changes would not have been necessary. Um, it would not have been possible to eliminate certain words from our vocabulary. It would not have been possible to, as it were, blackwash, the opposite of whitewash, blackwash certain words, ascribing to them a meaning that is not appropriate to them, that had nothing to do with them etymologically or in their past use, and transforming them into these kinds of moralistic monsters. It would not have been possible either to erode some of the finer words of our language that have really fallen into just a tremendous disuse, and another striking sign of the poverty of our souls. Words like nobility and virtue and honor and things of this sort that once constituted the common discourse of our peoples and now are practically non-existent in our day-to-day use unless we
I,
really apply ourselves to use them. So I mean, that lack of an underpinning, of a foundation, I think, is really the root source of all of this, and that's what really I think we have to be looking toward.
a few things immediately come to mind, but I'll start on the last thing you said about words like virtue and nobility. We've spoken about this before. You could easily think of people imagining those to be old-timey sounding words and or kind of lame and they don't really mean anything. They're thrown around. which leads me to irony. What do you think the role of like everything being seeped in irony has been? What is that a symptom
Well, it's an interesting question, Jared, because irony is one of these words. It's one
of? Oh,
of the words
yes,
that has been
that's true. Yes, yes.
taken, commandeered, transformed, manipulated, and made into something that it really isn't. Irony is one of the great facets of European discourse and has been since the time of Socrates, if not before. It is the ability to speak with a mind toward one's listener. It's connected deeply with rhetoric. It's also connected with the question, the problem of people who uh, you know think about things that are difficult from a societal point of view, and they want to be able to get to the bottom of really difficult and thorny questions, but they can't publicly declaim those views, and so they have to find a way around that. Well, this is something we're confronting in our own time. Irony could be a very useful tool for us in its original sense, insofar as it
Mm,
allows us to speak of things without speaking of them in such a way that we might become targets to an ever more observant and intense surveillance system that's kind of weaving its web around us. So, I mean, it's another example of this sort of a thing that's been stolen from us, because irony is something that should be our heritage as Europeans. It's part of our millennial history, and it's something that we can use in our contemporary day if we understand it properly to fight against the changes that are coming. But
maybe a
instead, it's
better
been
maybe a better way to say it would be nihilistic language then today.
exactly, because that's what it's come to mean, right? It's used in the sense that you're ironic, you don't really believe in anything, you kind of laugh at things, you scoff at things. An ironic person is a scoffer nowadays, and
Yeah.
that is very, very, very nihilistic. And obviously, so far as that's concerned, I think that the only thing that one can say about it is that it is a symptom of the times. Anyone who believes that they're being original with that kind of just radically nihilistic perspective is badly mistaken. This is old hat and has been for at least 100 years. And the only difference about it is that now they can go around and publicly parade their nihilism. But the absence of any kind of a value that is of such a sacred nature that you are not willing to subject it to mockery or to scorn. I mean, that's not something to be proud of. And if you are proud of it, I think that's a sign of something perhaps wrong in a human soul, something that needs to be adjusted in some way. Um, I don't know if
There's
that gets to
another
your question, Trevor.
Well, there's a yeah, like I said, there's a few things going on. You, I thank you for making that important distinction because I fell into that just calling it irony like everyone else does. But you're absolutely right. Um, I mean, yes, there are there's that sense of the sacred, but then at the same time, we are saying that people of European descent in the West has always been about inquiry and debate and analyzing and picking apart things. And I have to wonder sometimes where that line is and
Difficult
if we
line to
could
find.
put a finer and finer point on through the work that we do. I'm not saying we're gonna figure the whole thing out right here and now, but
Certainly,
the
Jared. We have what, another 45 minutes? We'll get it.
yeah, yeah. Well, we're ambitious if nothing else. But through these kinds of conversations we have and learning together as we all do, maybe it'll help us put a finer point on a healthy. Well, I think we've spoken about this too. It's when you can pick something apart. The best I can do right now answering the question I'm posing is constructing. You can pick something apart, but with an eye on making it better, constructing it, or making it foolproof against what could come against it or what could harm it, versus that kind of just destroying for destruction's sake and that nihilism. I'm not saying there aren't finer points or nuances to explore there, but that I know now that I'm saying it, now I'm kind of piquing my own memory. I know that theme has come up with again. I think all of us here. Um, I do want to just make another distinction quickly too, for anyone listening, that when speaking about language, it doesn't mean that in the past everything was so prim and proper. I mean, there's pretty funny, outrageous examples of political debates right from the get-go in this country. I'm sure it was
Yes.
going on long before in the old continent as well. Of you'd have two guys running for office or something, and there'd be like just these wild claims about their personal lives, and so we're not saying that everything was, especially when talking about politicians vying for power. We're not saying that everything was all gentlemanly and refined. We're talking about something a little different here, though. As you said, the frame of people having the ability to understand the world around them without the constraints that we're given today, which leads me to this question. Another thing that some of your opening comments had me thinking about is, do we know how much, I mean, there are people who research this, of course, but to what extent can you speak to the way people spoke and wrote 100 years ago or maybe prior? What's been lost over the last century, even in more recent decades? And I know that you are a great lover of the English language itself. And of course, you're a writer, as you said in the beginning. We've spoken again about the English language itself at times. What is your sense of this devolution of it? Or do you have any examples that you can give listeners speaking to this, and how, kind of, what's been taken away from people?
Well, I think that the most obvious thing that one sees when one compares the two kinds of language is the extreme simplicity of our contemporary vocabulary and the extreme specificity and complexity of the past vocabulary. Um, the use of words has certainly undergone an extreme diminution in our time. The number of words that people use. Now, if it is the case that words are not simply superfluous adjuncts to a language, and you just keep building on and adding synonyms on synonyms on synonyms, as some people seem to believe, but if rather new words are introduced in order to express concepts, in order to express things that we find in the world around us or in our experience of the world, then a reduction of the number of words that we use amounts more or less exactly to a reduction in our ability to express ourselves and our ability to grasp the things of our experience and to express them in discourse and to understand them and to work our own way through our views of these things in conversation. It amounts as well, of course, to an impoverishment of conversation, which is something that we focus on a lot here in Learning in Public. Um, so that's one of the things that one sees, and I think that that's an essential part of it. And I mean, I'm not even sure that it's necessary to cite specifically, striking examples. One could find really remarkable examples of the use of the English language even in our American history. Not even to go back as far as say Shakespeare or somebody who's just universally acknowledged to be a master of the tongue. But when you look at our writers like Hawthorne and Melville and Emerson and Thoreau, these are men who had a command of our language in a way that we really can't even hope to reobtain in many cases. And so it's a great training in our language to read them. But you can also look at things that are much more applicable to our present day situation in the form of the speeches or the debates that were given by presidents in the past. Look at Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, a man whose role in our country's history, I think, is to put it the very least questionable. I mean, I think that he's probably responsible for bringing in the era of American democracy, and there's a great deal that can be said about Lincoln, and much of it would be negative, not all of it. But when one looks at his use of the American language, and I use that word advisedly, American language, his American idiom, it is just a magnificent use of speech. It's an incredible use of rhetoric. It's a powerful and potent use of it, which comes down to us even to this day with expressions that we can draw upon in our common discourse as Americans. So that this shows instances of where these things can be found, but really just turning to the past and leafing through our old literature is sufficient to give a sense of these things. There's also a lack of complexity on the syntactical level. We don't use the same complexity of structural phrasing as we once did. This both in writing and in the spoken word. And it seems to me that this probably negatively impacts our ability to think and might also be a result, a consequence of our inability to think with the same clarity and the same ease, and even in a certain sense the same how can I put it, agility that we once possessed in our country. The use of language in America was once highly regarded. It was very important to be able to produce sound and competent rhetoric. Speech makers were very, very highly regarded. And this is a special part of our country that I think we really need to try to reclaim. As a more recent example, look at
It's all
H.L.
gone to
Mencken.
sales, John. It's all gone to sales. Or
Right,
all that
exactly.
rhetorical energy.
Yes, no, it has. And what's interesting about it is that even that, even that, we think of the old seller of snake oil back in the American far west, right? This kind of classic American figure who went around peddling nostrums that were completely worthless in themselves. How did he do that? He did it by convincing people to buy his wares. Now, I'm not suggesting we need to be snake oil salesmen by any means, but what I'm suggesting is that there's something even in, say, the far west, which is kind of regarded as this rugged, sort of crude and free for all scenario in which rhetoric, the use of language, was so important and it was so central to society that even somebody to sell something had to have a real command of the language. Nowadays, you have to have a command of human psychology or consumer psychology. You've got to have enough money to spend it in the right professionals who can tell you exactly what snappy little phrase to put on that's going to keep in people's heads when you add it to the right jingle and things like that. But it's just another great sign of the decadence in which we've fallen.
Yeah, if I could just jump in really quickly, and also, folks, let me know if the audio levels are roughly the same between all three of us at this point, so that you can just crank the volume up and have us about equal. That would be great. But this is a really fascinating conversation. It's a real shame that we don't have about 5,000 people watching live right now. So, folks, if you could grab the URL, share it with your circles of influence while we're live here on Tap, and maybe we can get some more people to join and learn a bit, because this is extremely important. This speaks directly to the tools with which we think. Those are words. Those words are constructs. If we don't have the constructs, the words for our own defense, we cannot defend ourselves. This is what we're talking about when it goes right to the actual machinery of going free, and how we effectuate such magnificent results where we see so little results or no results or deleterious consequences for the use of anti-white language, despite the fact that so many seem to think, and some people are perfectly honest and wonderful folks, and they're new to going free. They've never heard of it before, and they say, well, what's the difference between what you all are doing and a snarky, ironic, flippant response where I simply just invert what the anti-whites are saying and then think I've accomplished something, which was the same thing, isn't it? No, it's not the same thing at all. And you don't realize it, you don't discover it until you actually implement the lexicon and dialectics of going free. These are what I have referred to as thought chains. They are built with premises that create thought chains that enable you, the person who is advocating for white well-being, going free, to, of your own abilities, of your own prowess, to come to the right answers, the right conclusions in these conversations, because you have started in a place that can only lead you to a certain conclusion. The flip side of this is that the anti-white, when you force your language on them, they are on that same path and they cannot win in those conversations. That's the big difference. So, for example, we have a guy right now that I've been having a conversation with, and he said, well, the inverted all lives matter has thoroughly defeated the, what I won't say, the MLB. If you look in the mirror when you hear those words, you flip it around. We're not talking about Major League Baseball. And he was, he's right now, he's of the thought that this is as good as it gets. It's like the saying, what was the other one? It'll come back to me in a minute. It was another inversion. Oh, it's okay to be white. It's okay to be white. And this idea, this inverting of anti-white lexicon or locutions, this idea that it's somehow powerful, when really all of this is snarky. It's nihilistic. It is, I think, John, you used the word scoffer. It's just scoffing sort of at their language. It's saying, I know you are, but what am I? And these people are not able to go any further. And of course, I'm able to take, and I will do this in the future, I'm able to take the anti-white locutions and go up against anybody that anyone suggests using the verbiage of the anti-whites, just using these inversions, remaining within the anti-white narrative, and I will thoroughly defeat them. Just like at that very first high school where the It's Okay to Be White flyers showed up, I think it was in Maryland, and a non-white high school student defeated that argument. The very first day in an interview, the non-white high school student said, apropos, of course it's okay to be white. It's just not okay to be a racist. That's it. That's the end of that argument. And that's why you have to get out of the anti-white narrative and into a lexicon that empowers you. Now, specifically, and John really just spoke to my heart there a moment ago, and I'll pass it right back so we can hear more from the two of you. The specificity of language that we had in the past is dead or dying. It's nearly dead. It's on life support. And you end up having people, and this, of course, you know, there are many causes for this, the dumbing things down so that everybody can be the same, part of anti-whiteism, a consequence of anti-whiteism. And you end up with people not only using numerous synonyms for a specific thought that they are trying to share that end up being off the mark by quite a little bit. And what that ends up doing, and this is the most prevalent, I mean, this is ubiquitous, it is omnipresent that this happens. What that ends up doing is that it makes it very difficult for people like myself or John or Jared to communicate to the masses ideas, constructs, etc., that will benefit them, because they're trapped in this world of fewer and fewer ideas represented by numerous synonyms, which shouldn't be the case. But you even have an environment where you have antonyms that are used, and one of the antonyms that are used by people as a synonym that I hear among educated people is innervated for energized. There are numerous examples of this. How are we supposed to actually communicate ideas that empower people when the constructs, not just the words themselves, the words are the after effect, the constructs in the colloquial are so reduced that we cannot create. And then when we come along and we say, okay, we are now Western kind and we are serving white well-being, and we say these things, people say, well, you're making up funny words. You're making up these funny words, and don't you know you're only allowed to use the words that the anti-whites permit you to use, because those are only the legitimate words. Now, here's the thing that is the real kicker, and I'll pass it right back, and then you two can grapple with this for the enjoyment and edification.
No, I have a question for you two.
Well, the final thing I'll say is this, is that you see this argument that you can only use the words that the anti-whites approve, from the least educated and the least intelligent all the way up in the white sympathetic spheres to the most educated and most intelligent. These people I have had, I'm not going to name them right now because it would be too close, but to name them. But there are people that I've been friends with for decades that are graduated fabulously from fabulous universities, highly educated, extraordinarily well read, and they have argued and argued and argued with me. No, you may not. In fact, all the way back to the early 90s, and when I thought I was inventing anti-white and anti-whiteism, because it wasn't in the dictionary. They weren't in the dictionaries. They weren't in the dictionary that I had in my house, which I still have. They weren't in the dictionaries of the public library. The anti-whites had cunningly, intelligently ripped that page out of the dictionaries so that we couldn't defend ourselves by saying there was this assault on our people, which meant that we had to defend our people. All the way back to then, when these individuals were saying to me, no, those aren't in the dictionary, you can't use them. And I said, well, people know what it means. They know what anti is. They know what white is. They know what the ism is on the end of words. What's the big deal? Why not you legitimize it rather than me, this peon, going out and using these arguments with people. But this is, and Jared, we'll hear your question, but this is the sort of uh, the perfunctory nature of attempting to communicate to our brothers and sisters, the vagues out there, what they need to know in order to be able to defend themselves in their lives, just to themselves when they look in the mirror, to improve their own lives, to protect their children, to protect their families. And Jared, your question.
You bring up a very, very interesting conundrum that we're facing, Jason. Obviously, part of what we're doing here is, conservative in the original sense of the word. We're attempting to conserve something, and that's connected, obviously, to a sense of tradition, a sense of something that has been passed down to us. It's our heritage that we have to preserve and perpetuate. I think that a consequence of that is that we are all naturally sort of more inclined toward a conservative view of things than toward a view of things that might be willing to step out and produce novelties, or that might say there's a problem here that we have to resolve. We've got to find a new way of confronting it because the old ways are falling flat on their face. And language is a really touchy point as far as that goes, because the idea of a neologism, this word that you bring up out of nothing, seems in a certain way to kind of strike against the tradition that we've had handed down to us. I think there are a couple of things that can be said about that. First of all, English has always been a tremendously innovative language. It has always been incredibly productive of new words to confront new situations. This is one of the great virtues, its resiliency, it's just incredible versatility. So that obviously has to be said. Even beyond that, though, I think that this gets to a wider question of, really the time in which we find ourselves, in which the old forms are passing away where they have not withered and died. And the consequence of that is that we need to find some kind of a new ground upon which to stand. We need to build it where it's not there underneath our feet, obviously with an eye toward the older forms, obviously with an eye toward our traditions, informed at every step by where we've been, because we do have that sense of conservation and we cannot lose it without losing what is essential to our attempt here, to our very mission. But if we just leave it at what's been given to us, one of the major problems of that is that it has been under assault now for 100 years by very, very innovative and clever people who have produced this kind of a language, which we all find ourselves using here and there. I mean, even those of us who make the greatest efforts to escape, but will find ourselves now and then falling into the trap of simply, assuming common use with terms, with words that have these secret barbs in them that have been laying there precisely to catch us in the throat and snag us like fish. And so I think that that's one of the things that really has to be foremost in our minds, and clearly was, Jason, when you began this work so long ago, that you continued up until the present day. With I'm sure the people who are familiar with it and have put these terms to use, they can attest to the great usefulness of it, the great need of something like that in our time, because the old concepts do have to be renovated. They have to be resurrected and brought back into use. But in many cases, we're fighting a new war on new ground that's been produced only very recently. We need to make use of the great resources of our language, the great, just remarkable richness and abundance and the productivity of the English tongue in order to face these things.
Yeah, there's a lot to discuss, and maybe we could have like a specialty episode just on language, because I might even you're addressing, both of you are addressing the question that I have, and I'll mention it, but with the caveat that I don't even know if it's worth getting into. I mean, Jason is having a great amount of success, and it's kind of like getting under the hood of what he does, because the question is essentially, as we've been dancing around it, how you escape that quicksand of, if we want to communicate with a fair number of people and the discourse has lowered to this abysmal level, but we also want to raise people up to these higher standards and virtues, where's that dance? Where's that balance? How do you dip down so you hit enough people, you emotionally charge enough people, and you set a little light bulb off in enough people where you're not just accused of, sitting in an ivory tower and talking to your three friends who share your intelligence level, but then so what? You want to affect change, but you don't want to just say, well, and I understand the practicality of this. I've seen people in the chat saying, well, Trump had to use like a fourth or fifth grade reading level kind of vocabulary, and if he didn't, he wouldn't have gotten elected. Um, Different conversation as to whether or not that was worth it. You know, regardless of whether you think of Trump, the fact of the matter is he did use language and the force of his personality to gather this movement around him, at least for some time, right? So that was my question, but I feel like that could take the whole rest of the show, and I don't even know if
Right.
it's worth getting into. But you are our guest, and I would not be doing my job if I didn't give you a chance to respond to that. But again, that was really with both of you in mind. I mean, John, of course, you're a writer, you're a great appreciator of the English tongue and well versed, well read in the great tradition of our Western canon. And Jason, you have been having this great success of affecting people's lives. We're seeing it happen. So maybe we can make some brief comments on it now, and maybe we'll do other shows that get more into the nitty gritty, and maybe that's the sole focus. But
We'll
John, as our
probably
guests, anything?
it would definitely be worth doing an entire show on that single question because there's so much to be said about it. I will be as succinct as I can be, and really I could just leave it at this: that Jason is the man to ask about this, and not myself, because as you know me, Jared, I tend, without even wanting to err in the other direction, which is toward a degree of, I don't know. I don't have this. Well, one thing that I could say, I suppose, is if we go back to the old kind of populist rhetoric in the United States, we find that that rhetoric itself was of a very high caliber. I'll return to the speeches of Lincoln. These were the speeches that were widely regarded. They were responsible for propelling him to the presidency in many cases. They are expressions that have come down to us from that time. They remain in our common vocabulary. One sees them popping up in discourses even to this day. But these are speeches that were given to in a popular context. Now, we're living in different times than Lincoln, because in our time, we have these wonderful things like the television and the internet that really have not done a great deal for us on the level of our intellects and our language, so far as I'm concerned. That's an entirely different discourse. But the question of, in my personal opinion, it is probably best to err toward the more complex use of language, the more correct use of language, than in the other direction, even if it seems like there might be some temporary results which one could gain as a consequence of the other movement. Populism in our time sort of compels us to go in that direction, but I think there are really a great many problems with populism, and I don't see how we can really hope for much from it. But that really does enter into a wholly different terrain. But as I said, Jason is the man to ask about this.
Well, we did want to get to populism and elitism too, and I will say, as maybe a way to, what I'm getting from your question, and to set this to Jason for a moment, is it kind of like teaching a person where you maybe want to put it just a little ahead of them. So in this case, you wouldn't want to stoop to the average American reading level right now, but you wouldn't want to have this highfalutin PhD level kind of discourse if you were on public television. You have to be able to sell it. Like this has come up a few times, Jason. It came up when I was on Yiz's show recently. This is one quick way to think of it. Again, whether you like him or not, Joe Rogan has a tremendously popular podcast in the United States and probably in many other countries as well. Who would you want to see on Joe Rogan if Joe Rogan gave 2 or 3 hours to someone from our circles and said, I'm going to give an open-minded, uncensored airing of your whole thing? Or take the personality out of it. So let's say it's not about me or Jason or John or other people you may like or not like in these spheres. If there was someone who imbibed all of this person's material and could be a very good representative of what they're about, who would you want to have that golden opportunity to speak to millions of people? It would have to be someone who had the understanding, as we're talking about, and had the intelligence. But it's funny, I'm already taking more time than I wanted to, forgive me, but I'll just wrap it up quickly by a couple things. First of all, we use this word intelligence very broadly too, but I say this a lot. Social intelligence goes a long way. It's not just about this very academic, throwing stats, throwing facts and figures. So you have to have a person that weds that kind of analytical mind with a social intelligence, which brings me back to where I was beginning. Maybe it's, and Jason, I want to get your thoughts on this, but maybe it has to do with that idea of how we teach people or how we inspire people, where you just put it a little bit ahead of them. So maybe there's something to that. But Jason, what are your thoughts?
If I might, just very briefly on the Joe Rogan question, my money would be on Jason.
He'd be a good bet. I'd rather see Jason than most other people, huh?
Well, I very much appreciate that from both of you, the two high quality folks that you are. That's quite an endorsement. So I really appreciate that. And so that we can keep the conversation going and we can bookmark this. I'd love to come back and have an entire tap on language. That would be fantastic. Maybe we could do like a 2-parter where it's like the learning in public and is part 1, and then part 2 is on tap. That would be kind of
That's an interesting idea. That's a great idea. Yeah.
A crossover there. That would be great. And then we could get everybody going from one to the next. So that would be really exciting. I'll just say
We'll do that.
my experience was that really, I guess, chance put me in a great spot. And I guess for my desire to do good for our people, because it started off with children that were, my age. I was a 11-year-old, and then it worked up through, of course, the teenage years. And then I got into employment and I worked both blue and white collar professions. So I was confronted with people who had wildly disparate backgrounds, and also in Northern Virginia, outside Washington, D.C., really heterogeneous racially. So people who had different backgrounds, people who had different levels of education, different levels of intelligence, and different types of intelligence, not just levels of intelligence. And I made the arguments that I was told to make by the old timers and how to bring folks over. And I experimented with some new ideas, some of my own. Some of them fell flat on their face. I was totally committed in the Aristotelian method of, whatever was empirical is what mattered. Even if I thought about it long enough and it seemed like it would work, it seemed like it was correct, I would still subject it to the scientific method. And then if it wasn't working, I dumped it. And it went so far as I would run experimental leafleting campaigns in different towns across Virginia and just see how much the response was, how many people were interested, what kind of verbiage were they interested in, what were they hearing, and the processing. So I continually, and then this is my suggestion and the way that we continue to go, is that I think in some sense, there's a big part of me I think it's regrettable. When I first started writing Go Free, and it was those first pamphlets, and I have to find some of those because they were, they were like 20 pages long. I wrote with the words that specifically said what I was trying to say. And it looked good to people who were, quite educated, and especially with high verbal IQs. And they said, wow, you're being very specific here but nobody else was getting it. And it took some humility on my part to go back again and again to people, to keep resubmitting the text to folks of different education levels and the like, for them to say, oh no, I actually got to the point where I was saying, here's the text, just circle every word you don't know. And it was unreal how many, even college educated individuals from around the globe, the thing is just, if it was digitally, they would highlight, and if it was in printed form, they would circle for me. And I had to keep rewriting so that it was even though it wasn't as precise as I wanted, it was in a language that they could receive. And that's really what matters, because an excuse for me has never been enough. So I can't say I failed and here's a great excuse. I don't allow myself to do that. And the people who have worked for me, I don't accept excuses. So when I've managed folks, and because that's how I am with myself. And ultimately, the last thing I'll say about this is, stepping back to the beginning of that question, is that in application of the specific words that were chosen, etc., I was always trying to achieve the tightest verbiage that an individual could assimilate and then use in the world around them, so that they could spread it, because that was extremely important. It wouldn't be any good if I could articulate something in a way that they could understand, but then could not reproduce. So I needed the folks to be able to reproduce. That's how anti-white and anti-whiteism for me was such an epic discovery. Because if I could, and everybody can do this in your lives, you're going to have people who have never heard the word anti-white, have never heard of anti-whiteism to represent all of those doctrines that in some way victimize Western kind. You just use those words and make sure you pay attention to their eyes, because the moment they hear you encapsulate with a single construct, and therefore all of the derivative constructs that they can begin to put together on their own, the moment you do that for them, it is like the sun has ripped through the clouds. I mean, it's so cliche and so true. And so that's where I go to. I meet the person where they are. So in one sense, I find this extraordinarily lamentable, because I would like to speak in a more precise language, and I would like us all to be able to think, because speaking in the precision, as I started with my first response, is thinking in precision. So I would like us all to be there, but we're simply not there. So I find it lamentable. On the other side, I just fully accept what reality is going to require in order to get that outcome of improving the lives of individual Westmen, men, women, and children. And the bottom line is, with these words, Western kind, for example, everybody knows, if they never heard it before, they know what it is immediately. It didn't matter whether the people were construction workers or they were lawyers that I worked with. They immediately got it. It didn't matter whether they were a plumber or an accountant that I worked with. When I talked about anti-whiteism, they immediately understood what anti-whiteism was, and they didn't question me, because they weren't in competition with me to try to, I guess, within these white sympathetic spheres, make me look bad or get people to ignore me or whatever it was. They weren't in any sort of competition. So they just accepted the verbiage for the empowerment that it gave them. And internally, as they dealt with themselves, the ideas that they were brainwashed with. And John, if you haven't seen it, you really have to see this on, I've set it aside. I cut it apart as a standalone video now. This 18-year-old beautiful young woman, and she's having that moment we talk about, that all of us have felt, where it's that moment of purest beauty and heroism and glory, because she's deciding at 18 that she's sick and tired of the way she and our people are being treated. She wants to feel pride for our people. She wants our people to be able to celebrate our achievements, etc., to not be white erased. And she's now facing the paths of which to take. Is she going to make that error and head down one of these villainy roles that she sees as options within the anti-white narrative, which is where she's living? And in which case she'll have a particular dress, a particular language that she'll speak, a particular icons that she'll use that will ruin her life? Or is she going to go like the path of going free, where she's going to be a hero in our story, where she's going to be able to defeat those? I mean, you can imagine, I give the example, I think on that video, I'll pass it right back so we can keep rolling. But the example I give is, I think on the video, conversation with her parents. Let's say her parents don't feel the same way that they're very scared of the world, the anti-whites. They're scared of what will become of their daughter if she starts to speak out against anti-whiteism. And so they want to discourage that. What will happen with that relationship if she comes home and she begins with this monomaniacal focus on some other race of people or several races of other people, and she's just cussing them or whatever it is. And then the parents are going to be fearful for what's going to, that's going to strain that relationship. It's going to make her life miserable, versus coming home and using the lexicon of Going Free, using our story, which is, this is where the people get it really wrong. They think it's just another set of words. It's not just another set of words. It's a completely different worldview. That's what you have to accept. And those other folks also that get it wrong, where they say it is for optics, they are under the delusion that we are actually villains in the anti-white narrative, and we're trying to conceal this with some sort of layers of optics cucking, when nothing could be further from the truth. So if you're here, if you're listening to my voice and you think that this is some endeavor to conceal that we are really like you because you're some sort of villain in the anti-white narrative, well, you are flat out wrong. We're nothing like you. We have a completely different moral compass. And we also are not being led around by the nose by the anti-whites, who are having you do, as a villain in the story, exactly what they want you to do. So this is how important, I would just, the final note I will make here in this poetry prose is that how important is language? And before we move on here, how important is language and the words we use and the story we're in? Well, it's this young woman's life right now. Where is she going to end up? If she goes down that ugly path, everyone knows where she's going to end up. Her life is going to be miserable. She'll be white flighting into horrible things. If she goes a very different route, going free, then the stratosphere is only the beginning. I'll pass it right back.
Yeah, just to quickly round off this question of language, Jared, unless you have another question or observations or remarks to make about it. But I did just want to say, first of all, regrettably, I've not seen that video, Jason, but I will absolutely remedy that. I'm going to look that up as soon as we're done with this, as a matter of fact. I think that the way you've described it, it makes it sound like a very, very intriguing and very, very inviting glimpse into what language can do for us. And I would point out that, everything that you've said, Jason, I agree entirely with it. I think that it would be a mistake to say that we all have to use language in exactly the same way in all cases, right? I mean, obviously language, particularly English, is capable of molding itself to different scenarios and different contexts and different situations, and that's one of its great merits, and that should be fully exploited by us. So if you're writing a pamphlet for public consuming, that obviously consumption, that's obviously different than if you're writing lyrics for a song, Jared. If you're writing, the narratives that you put into your books, Jason, the fiction that you put in there as well, or the autobiography or things like that. If you're writing a poem, all of these have different audiences, first of all, but they also have just a different idiom, a different natural style that should accompany them, and that should be exploited, I think, to the fullest by us. So it's not a question of simply, deciding how we're going to use language, and then we have to use it always in that particular way. If you're giving a speech, it's a different scenario than if you're in a private conversation with a friend, right? These are different cases. You have to use language in a different way. I think there are some general rules that could be laid down. I mean, a few of them that I'm particularly keen on. One is the obscenities. I just think that we should really reduce the amount of obscenities that we commonly have in our language. This is not simply a moral question, although I think there are moral questions involved in it. But just from the point of view of our command of our language, obscenities become crutches to us. They stand in for real words and real concepts, and we just kind of crawl around using these words to mean any old thing. Which, first of all, is demeaning to the world in which we find ourselves because of the nature of obscenities, but it's also demeaning to our intellects and our ability to, really fully grasp what we're looking at. The other thing that I think speaks directly to what you were saying, Jason, is the question of what we presently call memes. And I'm very, very contrary. I'm thoroughly against this idea that language is a structure of memes. I think that is, again, demeaning of language. It is a demoting of language. Language is not just a spontaneous and absolutely unconscious reproduction, parrot-like, of things that have come into our heads. The moment it becomes that is the moment we become slaves to somebody else's worldview, Jason. Is exactly what you were saying. This is really very key. We have to use our language consciously, whatever level we're using it, whatever way, context we find ourselves. It has to be conscious, and that's the great benefit of this lexicon that you're working on, Jason, that it is conscious from start to finish. And so it really does command us to be more aware of the way that we use our language, of the meaning and the consequences of our words, and to clean up our act in many cases. I mean, a meme. What is a meme? A meme is something like this superfluous like that's crept into the American language, where we just say like anything with like after it, which of course means that everything we're talking about is vague. We're not certain about what we're saying. Like, of course, means that it's like something. It's not quite something else. So it's a kind of approximation. It has this sort of approximative value to our language. That kind of a thing has to be cut out. We've got to get rid of the memes. We don't want memes, and we're not trying to even plant memes. We're trying to expand awareness. We're trying to expand consciousness. And I think this is the great value of your project, Jason.